Dear students, now we are going to discuss civil society's its emerging role as a 48th lesson in the course of Indian administration. There are two objectives to study this. One, identify the meaning and importance of a civil society. Two, trace the civil society movements in India. In recent decades, there has been a total rethinking of the developmental strategies we adapted in the post-independence period. This rethinking has been partly stimulated by the still persisting socio-economic problems of both rural and urban masses, as well as the neglected tribes of the hilly regions. These developmental strategies have not only failed to solve the problems of poverty, illiteracy and health insecurities, but also instead added newer problems to the existing list of issues. In attempting for introspection as to what went wrong with the whole exercise, invariably the state emerges as the anti-hero at the end of the most of the analysis. The state-centric developmental approach followed by the post-colonial Indian state has been held accused for all the misadventures. Though the development has been carried out within the ideological framework of as well as the functioning of a vibrant democratic Indian polity, the central role given to the state and its bureaucracy in the development project seems to have precluded any real democratic participation of the masses, the local communities, whose living space has been the site of developmental activity. Though it was in their names, it was not in their interest, critics complain. This is the historical background which is seeing the emergence of many new social movements and voluntary sectors focusing on specific issues for the furtherance of the values of a democracy. A resurgence of the category of civil society has been the response to these experiential developments from the domain of theoreticians. The eclipse of civil society due to the towering figure of the state is held to be responsible for the development approach not reaching its proclaimed destination of the welfare of the masses. A revival and reconstruction of an active civil society supposed to be a precondition for the realization of true democracy and development are advocated by the proponents of such views. In this lesson unit, we will attempt to look into the conceptual as well as the practical issues that inform this kind of alternative framework of development and democracy. Civil society changing notions. The contemporary hype about civil society has been caused by the breakup of the socialist regimes in Russia and Eastern Europe and the revival of Tocquevillian tradition of celebrating the associational pluralism in the United States. It has been summarized that the Soviet type experiments have failed because of the absence of civil society in such states. Civil societies has been hailed as the property of the liberal democratic states, and a flourishing civil society has been considered as the preconditions for the existence of a democracy. The concept of civil society has an interesting history. It has always been a part of liberal democratic theories. The liberal notion conceives of civil society as a sphere independent of but to be protected by the state, wherein the rights bearing individuals are free to pursue their private interest in free association with others. Thus, definition reduces civil society to that of free market or free economy. Later, liberals like J.S. Mill and Alexis de Tocqueville conceived civil society as a domain of social associations which would check the excesses of the state. They were concerned about the growing power of the state and held the view that without active social associations, even democracies could become despotic regimes. But it was successful in its attack on Hegel for subordinating the civil society to the state. Hegel saw in civil society the mediating domain where the particular interest of the individual and the universal interest of the state could be reconciled in producing an ethical basis for the modern society. Hegel was concerned about the loss of morality in the modern society due to the non-availability of traditional community relations to the modern humans. However, civil society characterized by its particular tendencies, if left alone, will destroy itself. In Hegel's view, though, civil society embodies the unique achievement of modernity, that of the individual, it has to be organized and institutionalized through the state. Gramsci, another philosopher, deepened our understanding by the civil society by extending the Marxian logic. Instead of depicting civil society as only embodying the practices of production and exchange relations, the Gramscian notions characterizes it is a set of social relations that stand between the individual and the state. Consent is produced for the dominance of the state through the hegemonizing the impulses of the various institutions, practices and the concomitant myths and symbols at the site of civil society. Gramsci claims that a hegemonized civil society or captive civil society is responsible for revolutions not taking place even under classic cases of the presence of required economic crisis. The simplest, most common meaning given to civil society is all public activity by an individuals, organizations or movements other than the government employees acting in governmental capacity. In the broadest sense, it encompasses all social, economic, cultural and political relations, but the emphasis is usually on the political aspects of these relations. Thus, it can be used in reference to any level from the local to the country as a whole or even global interactions. It also clearly goes beyond the traditional NGOs to all forms of networks, caucuses and movements. As a result, it serves as a political tool for all those who want to promote innovative, wider and deeper levels of political participation. Arguments from Indian scholars. Though historically the space provided by the civil society has been appropriated and hegemonized by the dominant classes, it suggests possibilities for the reappropriation of civil society by other social actors as well. However, in recent times, theorists like Partha Chatterjee and Sudipta Kaviras have given interesting arguments regarding civil society in the third world countries in general and India in particular. They point out the fallibility and incompatibility of the Western ideas and forms of governance that have been imposed through colonial intervention. At the same time, this imposition for quite a long time has initiated various processes in its attempt to introduce political modernity in these societies. The Western notions of the state and civil society are not useful categories in understanding the Indian situation, since the nature of these institutions have become substantially different from those of their European counterparts. The uncritical application of the concepts of state and civil society to evaluate the Indian situation has caused many distortions. They view with skepticism the attempts of those scholars who are privileging the civil society by decrying the dominant role of the state. According to them, the state in India is less extensive than those its Western counterparts. Sudipta Kaviras's final statement about the debate on civil society is quite instructive, which is as follows. It is the nature of the problem that the debates about civil society remain inconclusive, but these are not for that reason fruitless. After all, these debates form parts of a collective reflection of the nature of the conditions which political democracy requires to take root and flourish, precisely because its elusiveness and intractability, the idea of civil society in the third world forces us to think about the social terrain behind explicit political institutions and try to explicit what happens in that essential but relatively dark analytical space. New social movements. The earliest of social movements in India could be traced to the Gandhian efforts of Sarvodaya. Gandhi recognized the need for social change, but he believed that the change has to come from the bottom to top if it has to be non-violent, successful and permanent. Sarvodaya was a direct offshoot of Gandhi's constructive program. According to Radhakrishna, the ideological paradigm of Sarvodaya sought to create a stateless and classless society of Gram Swaraj, establish the principle of sharing voluntary such as through Bhudan and Gramdan, develop village industries and agro-industrial communities and apply the Gandhian concept of trusteeship in industrial activities. But the limitations of this approach of moral persuasion have been well documented by history. Though it evoked much hope in the beginning, the gross failure of Bhudan in land redistribution through voluntary means has evaporated that hope. Since 1970s, a number of social movements emphasizing on a range of basic issues have come to animate the sphere of civil society. They are new in contrast to the old trade union and working class movements, which were political in the sense of having an alternate political vision of the state itself with the revolutionary ideals. But the people's movements, as they are called, are the result of broader based people's responses to ecological or gender or caste conflicts. The distinguishing feature of these movements is that they are not homogeneous and differ in their origins. In many cases, the local initiatives merge and give rise to the formation of a large scale movement at the intervention of intellectuals backed with media support. As Vignaraja further points out, only some of the people's movements have been sustainable over time, others are eruptions and die down after a while. Similarly, some of the grassroots experiments represent seeds of change, while others are mere bubbles. He further elaborates on how to differentiate between a seed and a bubble. A seed can be identified with such broad aims as equality and access to resources, equality of social, political, cultural rights, real participation in all social decisions affecting work, welfare, politics, etc., the end of division between mental and manual labor and the use of technology appropriate for this purpose. It is not, however, merely a matter of stating these objectives: genuine participation, self-production and self-management, autonomy, solidarity and innovativeness. A bubble, on the other hand, is a soft process and may not last for a variety of reasons. Points to change and some can be transformed into seeds through additional sensitization and conscientization programs, training of facilitators and change agents. Self-employed women's association, that is famously called as SEVA, the CHIPCO movement, the Kerala Science movement, that is Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad, and the Narmada Bachao Andolan Samiti are seeds in this point. There are innumerable other movements as well, differing in degrees of mobilization, conscientization and organization for development and democracy. Now, we shall look into some of the movements that have highlighted issues of great concern to people and ecology. Chipko deserves to be listed foremost them all. Chipko as a spontaneous movement started in the early 70s and got organized under the able leadership of Sundarlal Bahuguna. It was ignited by the opposition of the people of the Tahri Garhwal region to the cutting of trees by the outside contractors. In the Himalayan regions, forests form an indispensable source of livelihood for the mostly tribal population living there. Chipko literally means hugging the trees. The movement articulated the concerns of forest-based communities such as depletion of forests, erosion of soil and consequent landslides, drying up of local streams and other water resources, and shortages of fuel and fodder for domestic consumption. It also fought against the construction of the Tahri Dam, which threatened the eviction of around 25,000 hilly residents. Though the movement has not succeeded in all its endeavors, it has achieved some commendable victories. Getting ban on cutting trees above an altitude of 1000 meters and making the government to announce certain forest areas as protected regions are some of the successes of the movement. Chipko, being a non-violent resistance movement, embodies the Gandhian spirit of struggle. Chipko movement inspired green cover movements elsewhere in the country, the most important being the Apico movement in the Western Ghats against the overfelling of trees and covering forest lands with commercial trees replacing the natural ones. The slogan of Chipko movements, ecology is economy. Another major social movement has been that of Anna Hazare, who has been fighting since more than 2 decades for bringing about transparency in bureaucratic apparatus of the state. His movement has changed his village Ralegaon Siddhi in Maharashtra into a model village. His movement emphasizes the right of the common people to know the information regarding government initiatives and the implementation procedures of the welfare schemes. The government is being pressurized to enact the Right to Information Act. This legislation would entail the right of the people to gain access to government records and thereby bring transparency and accountability in the functioning of the government. This would ultimately serve to check corruption and rent-seeking practices. Yet another important movement of the present times is Narmada Bachao Andolan Samiti. This movement, led by Medha Patkar, has sensationalized the issue of building huge dams as a solution for growing stress on water resources. This movement is in opposition to the construction of nearly 3,000 major and minor dams across the river Narmada, which would submerge an estimated 3,550,000 hectares of forest land and 2 lakh hectares of cultivated land. About 1 million people are estimated to become ousters. There have been a number of other struggles prioritizing issues related to women, Dalit empowerment, land use and pollution related issues. Women's movements, lacking a tradition equivalent to that of French and English feminist movements, have reached a point where they are able to identify common cause with all those movements which would further the advancement of the values of democracy and sustainable development. Dalit movements also heading forward in the same direction. The new social movements are indicators of the pulse of the people that they are no longer ready to accept the developmental paradigms that keep them out and preclude their participation. They may not be concerned with the capturing of the state power through revolution, yet they may be building consciously or unconsciously a countervailing power to the dominant state power. The new social movements also represent ways to humanize the larger macro developmental processes in order to demonstrate the fact that the modes of incorporation into the modern world at all levels could be altered. These movements also show how people cope with multiple and simultaneous crises and move on. People's movements are emerging out of peculiar contradictions within societies and cultures in transition. They may also arise out of contradictions and weaknesses that appear in the role of the state and in the division of labor resulting from the intervention of transitional capital. The new social movements are also bringing about the horizontal integration of people instead of a hierarchical integration. According to Rajendra Singh, Nobel laureate, ecology movements constitute transitional, biophilic, universalized and moral movements. Their basic commitment and fundamental ideology not only transcend the human categories of caste, class, race, religion and nations, but also the categories of species, divisions and the divisions of the organic and inorganic world also. This movement is a unique event which brings together the otherwise divided humans on one platform around a single issue, mobilizes them to struggle for one cause, the defense of all living beings born and unborn. Among some political activists, there is a tendency to see organizations, particularly hierarchical organizations, as conservative and oppressive. As a result, NGOs may be seen as part of the established order. This view is enhanced by the fact that prominent NGOs may have a long history, complex structures, technical literature and a leadership who engage more with global politics than with their members or supporters. Thus, at times NGOs are contrasted with the new social movements. These can be portrayed as dynamic, innovative and non-hierarchical. The idea of a movement simultaneously invokes two dissimilar ideas: the political impact of mass action by very large numbers of people and the role of the individual person independently making his or her own voice heard. The oldest example is the labor movement going back to the 19th century. Since the 1960s, there have been references to the new social movements such as peace, women's rights, development, the environment and anti-racism. They were new partly because they were not based on class divisions and partly because new methods of mass mobilization became possible. In December 1999, a higher level of aggregation into a diffuse and incoherent coalition was recognized as the anti-globalization movement when mass demonstration disrupted in the Seattle Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization. In practice, the conservative/radical contrast between NGOs and social movements cannot be sustained. There are both conservative and radical NGOs and many other shades of political opinion along the spectrum. There are some writers, including some academics, who refer to progressive social movements as if all social movements were progressive. Furthermore, NGOs should not be contrasted with social movements because NGOs are essential components of social movements. If an idea is to catch the imagination of people, it has to be articulated by leaders through speeches, pamphlets or visual images. If the idea is going to reach large numbers of people, resources have to be mobilized and allocated to communication processes. If demonstrations are to occur, they have to be organized. If a movement is to achieve change, priorities have to be selected and targets designated. If a protest lasts more than a few days to become a movement, existing organizations or new organizations will provide the skeleton that transforms an amorphous mass into a strong body. This is not to say that social movements are composed solely of NGOs. A social movement is more than a coalition of NGOs and less than a society as a whole. In the 1990s, four mutually reinforcing processes of change led to emphasis on the concept of civil society. There was an explosion in global communication facilities, the new forms of private association, from transitional community organizations to networks and caucuses were recognized. The fall of communist regime in Eastern Europe and the military regimes in developing countries promoted participating in the new democratic systems, and the major UN conferences produced an unprecedented scale of global public engagement with intergovernmental events. Unfortunately, civil society is also imbued with contradictory and contested meanings. In contrast with the paucity of civil society activities in former authoritarian regimes, it is sometimes implied that civil society is an opposition to government. However, academics who adopt the critical theory approach of Jürgen Habermas take the opposite view. They see civil society as integrated with the state in maintaining bourgeoisie hegemony in capitalist societies. This approach is virtually unknown outside non-academic circles. A second confusion is whether civil society includes or excludes the academic activities. For some, civil society encompasses everything except government, but for others, there are three quite separate realms: government, civil society, and the economy. On the basis of the former assumption, the United Nations used the term civil society to express its desire to strengthen its relations with both companies and NGOs. The result was furious protests from those NGOs who blame companies for social exploitation, poverty, and environmental degradation. In particular, they were most upset to find the UN website providing links to its relations with both business and NGOs from a single civil society web page. The protests did lead to the UN adopting a wording that separated business from civil society. Lastly, as with several other terms, some people wish to see civil society solely in a positive light and exclude actors of whom they disapprove. Not only criminals and drug dealers, but also reactionary NGOs are occasionally referred as uncivil society. Despite these various problems, civil society is a useful way of going beyond the traditional NGOs and referring to all the ways in which diverse non-governmental actors are mobilized. Nevertheless, it is necessary to be explicit on whether economic actors are being included or not. The catapulting of civil society to the center stage of political discourse on political processes is like a double-edged sword. While it holds the promise of the democratizing the development phenomena by increasing popular participation, it also possesses the danger of undermining the legitimacy of the state. Though many NGOs are doing commendable service in the promotion of the values of freedom, democracy, social justice, and sustainable development, it has to be kept in mind that they can never have the reach of the governmental apparatus. As one author notes, even thousands of NGOs cannot replace the role of the government. The accountability of the NGO is also another issue of concern. As already noted, a majority of them are not registered under the Foreign Currency Regulation Act, but their importance lies in demonstrating to the public the possible democratic ways of development with their participation, and thereby makes the people to pressurize the government to bring constructive changes in the modes of development. Thank you.